the leave of this House, I'm going to take a moment as a parliamentarian and as a Canadian to address what happened this weekend. We saw an out-of-control mob take over the streets of one of the country's biggest cities. We saw them openly and proudly spewing hatred, spreading violence, and thumbing their noses at the values that every single parliamentarian in this place I know holds dear. Burning cars, injuring police officers, chanting slogans like the final solution is coming. I don't know what kind of Canada this is, but it's certainly not one that I recognize. And I know that many Canadians feel exactly the same way after watching that. And the Prime Minister's go-to response after an incident like this one is to say that this is not Canada. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to reckon with the fact that this is very much Canada. That is, of course, after he sided with the outrageous decision of the International Court, drawing a false equivalency between a liberal democracy and a terrorist organization that attacked that liberal democracy last year, which emboldened the very supporters that took to the streets to almost burn down a city. Our country is no longer a haven for law and order, for truth and justice, for peace, and for the freedom that we used to have. And Mr. Speaker, instead of talking about all of this, we are still here after 2 months of demanding the documents in this place, demanding that the Liberals turn over the documents to the police, instead of debating the very real issues and the consequences to Canadians that happened, that poured out into the violence that poured out into the streets over the last number of evenings and days, if you're on the campus of Concordia University. We're still talking about this. And we have become a nation where the rights of bigots and violent rioters trump the rights of freedom of religion and, sadly, of personal safety, something that I never thought that I would say on the floor of this House. And we have become a nation where the grievances of a small, petty, lawless minority govern the lives of a larger, law-abiding majority. And we have become a nation where we have lost the ability to put a stop to even the most despicable behavior. And instead, day after day in this House, we demand the same thing from the same government that refuses the same order. Day after day, we ask them to release the documents instead of talking about the issues that Canadians are seized with. This is a nation, Mr. Speaker, where it is no longer extraordinary to wake up, to read that another synagogue has been firebombed, or that another Jewish business was vandalized, or that another bomb threat was made at a Jewish school, or that gunshots flew through the windows. Kids as young as 17, 18, 19 years old are being arrested for crimes. Children in this country are being turned against one another, blinded by our ability to teach even the most basic tenets of respect and critical thinking, with the woke academics pushing DEI ahead of introspective thought, and their unions that have become a bastion of ideological drivel that has now become dangerous and has spilled out into our streets. Hate crimes in this country have more than doubled over 9 years. And instead, we are still talking about a document production order 2 months later in this House that you yourself told this government to produce, that you yourself told this government to turn over to the RCMP. That is the natural consequence, Mr. Speaker, of a Prime Minister and a government that cannot even utter the most basic condemnation of radical and extremist behavior in this country, who send one group of MPs to say something to one community and a different group of MPs to say the exact opposite to another community. Those days are over, Mr. Speaker. That's how it works in the Prime Minister's Canada, but that's not how it works in Canada. And I will say one thing, because we've talked about it in the House, and most recently from comments from the government House leader, but the bouncy castles and the hot tubs and the outdoor barbecues and a protest blocking several blocks in a single city, honking equals a national emergency. frozen bank accounts, and prosecutions. But rioting, targeting, harassing, intimidating the Jewish community for more than a year, torching cars, shooting synagogues and schools, calling for violence, murder, death, celebrating actual terrorists, carrying actual flags of terrorist organizations for over a year in this country, it equates to quote-unquote peaceful protest encouraged by members of this House. And Mr. Speaker, that is shameful, and every single Canadian sees it now. What's happening now is a hallmark of this government, a government that has held this place up for 2 months without turning over documents in this latest scandal of 400 million tax dollars, 186 conflict of interest broken. Ministers who cannot keep their jobs because they have misled the Canadian public and this House about their identity. That's what this government has come to. It has become a hallmark of the Prime Minister's leadership that has divided the Canadians based on every discernible characteristic of race, of religion, of gender, of age, of wealth, of vaccine status. The list goes on and on. And what happens when the same Prime Minister systematically attacks the pillars of our country, whether it's our criminal justice system, whether it's our Charter of Freedoms, whether even our national symbols, Mr. Speaker. He took Terry Fox out of the passport, replaced it with a squirrel, and allowed those who got the passport to take their citizenship ceremony on Zoom. That is a shame. And you should have known this, because the Prime Minister told everybody that, quote, Canada was a post-national state with no core identity. That's what happens in the cornerstone of a Liberal government's agenda to open our borders, let in terrorists and lawbreakers, get in with no background checks, and call anybody who questions it in this country a racist. And frankly, this weekend has shown everybody in this country, the Canadians are tired of it, and they are tired of that government. They are tired of them holding this debate up in this House without handing over the documents that you yourself told them to hang over. $400 million of tax dollars that the Canadians deserve to know where those tax dollars went. The Prime Minister and the Liberal government have made this country a playground for foreign interference, for division, for people who hate us to come here. And they've rolled out the welcome mat. And then what did he do? He left us in the cold. The chants of death to Jews grew louder in front of synagogues. He ignores calls for safety and security, and his threats to communities got more and more intense. He ignored and silenced the voices in his own caucus that are supposed to be the ones speaking out, the voices that are supposed to be standing up for their communities, that are supposed to have a seat at the table. He shoved them out of the room, and he doesn't listen to them anymore. And then as the masked mob took over the streets of Montreal, he decided that it would be better to spend the night dancing. And my question is when was he told? When was he told? And after he was told, did he stay there? Why did it take him an entire day until 12 o'clock the next day to utter even the most basic condemnation of what had happened in his own city that night? This is a country that welcomed generations of people from around the world, gave them shelter from persecution, and now we see that in our own streets. This is the country that used to stand up for our allies and for values around the world, a country where wherever you came from, whoever you were, that you were to come here and you were to be Canadian and you were proud of it. That's the country that we are not anymore. And it breaks my heart to see it, and I'm sure that it breaks the hearts of every Canadian to see and witness what they did this weekend. And by glossing over the clear problems, pretending they don't exist, as the Prime Minister does, is no way to run a country. It is no way to even run a parliament, which he certainly hasn't acquiesced to that demand that we are still here for today. When somebody has the courage to say and to stand up and see and to say what is happening here is wrong, and I refuse to stand by it. And I refuse to stand by it because I love what's being destroyed. That's a country that is worth living in, and that's the kind of leadership that we need. That's the kind of courage that we need, and that courage is growing. It's not only growing with me, but it's growing with Canadians right across the country, from all stripes, from coast to coast, that want the country that they used to know back. Canadians have had enough of the virtue signaling, enough of the holier-than-thou preaching, the lawlessness, the out-of-control crime, the free drugs, the chaos in our streets. Canadians just want to go to work. They want to raise a family. They want to afford a decent home in a safe neighborhood. They want to do that without being told how to think by some out-of-touch politician in Ottawa. And Canadians just want to wake up from this woke nightmare and bring back the Canada we used to know. And these aren't the Canadians that you will find occupying the streets of Montreal, rioting violently. They're not the ones camping out on the front lawn of a university campus for months at a time or engaging in terrorist cosplay weekend after weekend. They're the Canadians you'll find on a shop floor, in a small business along Main Street, in Legion halls, in town squares, and in communities everywhere. And they might be quiet, but they are the real heart of our country. And Mr. Speaker, they're going to have a champion when we elect a common sense, national majority Conservative government. We are going to deliver a country that is finally respected on the world stage and doesn't make headlines because of what is happening in our streets.